The gate at the end of the dry season. The pills came first, before coffee, before light. Dona Anselma Vega had arranged them this way for 11 years, ever since Dr. Medina in town had placed a small amber bottle on the examination table and said, with the particular gentleness that doctors reserve for news they cannot soften, "Your heart is working too hard, Dona Anselma. We need to help it rest." Since then, every morning began the same way. He would sit at the edge of his bed in the dark, feel for the bottle on the nightstand without turning on the lamp, shake out one small white tablet, and swallow it dry. One tablet for Monday, one for Tuesday. He kept them in a weekly organizer that Herminia had bought at the pharmacy in San Cristobal years before she died. A plastic tray with 7 little compartments, each labeled in her handwriting with a black marker. L, M, X, J, V, S, D. Lunes through Domingo. She had filled the first week herself, pressing each pill in with careful fingers, and then she had been gone before the second Sunday arrived. He still used her handwriting. He had bought replacement trays over the years. The pharmacy sold them in packs of 3, but he always traced the letters onto each new tray himself, copying her L's with their little downward hook, her D's that curved back like a question. It was a small thing. He was aware it was a small thing. By the time the pill dissolved and the first gray light came through the window slats, Anselmo was dressed. He moved slowly now. The heart that worked too hard also moved too slowly through the dark, but he moved deliberately. The way a man moves when he has no one waiting and no reason to rush, and has made a private agreement with himself not to become the kind of old man who shuffles. He wore the same thing every day: dark trousers, a guayabera the color of old linen, leather sandals that had been resoled 4 times. He owned 3 identical guayaberas. Herminia had bought them all in the same afternoon at the market in San Cristobal, saying it was more efficient. He had laughed at her then. He did not laugh now, but he thought of it every morning when he opened the wardrobe. The kitchen table had 4 chairs. This was a fact he had never changed and could not bring himself to change, though only one chair showed any sign of use, the one nearest the window, whose seat had worn smooth and whose left rear leg had developed a slight list over the years from bearing his weight every morning. The other 3 chairs were straight-backed and clean. Herminia's chair faced his across the table. The 2 side chairs faced each other. For a while, in the first years after she died, he had tried sitting in different chairs on different mornings, as if movement might trick grief. He had stopped after a year. He sat in his own chair. He left hers facing him. He drank his coffee black from a clay mug that Herminia had bought from a woman at the Tuesday market who made them in a small workshop behind her house. The mug had a thumb indent on the handle, the potter's habit, not a flaw, and Anselmo's thumb had worn into it over the years until it fit the way a stone fits the hollow it has been sitting in for a century. He drank slowly, looking out the window at the grove. The grove was 40 hectares, planted in the valley below the house and climbing the eastern slope. In the early light, before the mist burned off, the trees stood in their rows like something assembled with great patience, which they had been. Anselmo had planted the first 30 hectares himself, with his father, when he was 19 years old. The remaining 10 had been added in the 3rd year of his marriage, when he and Herminia had decided together that they would expand the south section if the harvest was good. The harvest had been very good that year. He remembered this with a clarity that surprised him still. Herminia, in rubber boots, walking between the trees with a clipboard, writing down which rows were bearing and which needed pruning, and him watching her from the truck and thinking that he was, beyond all probability, the luckiest man in the valley. 15 workers came in during harvest season, men from the town and from the ejido 3 kilometers east, men who had worked the grove for decades, whose fathers had worked it before them. Outside of harvest, he kept 6 on the permanent payroll, 3 for general maintenance, 1 for the irrigation lines, and 2, the Gutierrez brothers, Polo and Camilo, who functioned as something between employees and fixtures, having worked the grove since before Herminia died, and now, in their late 40s, serving as the institutional memory of the land when Anselmo's own memory occasionally snagged. He paid them fairly. He had always paid them fairly, because Herminia had kept the books, and Herminia believed, with a practical conviction that bordered on theology, that a man who cheated his workers would eventually find his grove cheated him in return. He had continued to keep the books after she died. He was not as neat as she was. The columns were straighter in her years. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the mug at the sink, set it to dry on the same cloth it had dried on every morning, and went out to begin the walk. The morning walk was 3 kilometers, down through the grove, along the irrigation ditch, up to the eastern rise where the oldest trees stood, and back. Dr. Medina had prescribed it. Not fast, not far, just moving. He went at the pace of a man who is paying attention to things, the color of the soil where the irrigation had been, the early fruit on the trees in the 3rd row. This year's crop was coming in smaller than last year, which worried him. The place near the ditch where the bank had been eroding since the rains and would need to be shored up before the next wet season. He was on his way back, passing through the rows near the gate, when he saw them. There were 4 of them at the gate. He stopped. The woman stood in front, which was the first thing he noticed. Not behind the children, not to the side, in front, with her back straight in a way that looked deliberate, the way a person holds themselves upright when every part of their body is tired and they have decided, on principle, not to show it. She wore a blue dress that had been washed many times and a dark rebozo across her shoulders. Her hair was braided and pinned. She was holding the handle of a wooden trunk, not large, the kind that would hold what a family keeps when they cannot keep much. Behind her, arranged in descending height like something out of a folk painting, were 3 children. The tallest was a boy of about 14, dark and serious-faced, with a knapsack on his back and the alert, slightly watchful look of a child who has been the oldest child in a difficult situation for long enough that it has become part of how he holds his face. Beside him, a girl of 10 or so, with eyes that moved around the grove with open curiosity, taking inventory. And at the very back, holding the hem of his mother's dress with one small fist, a boy who could not have been more than 5, round-cheeked, dark-eyed, looking at Anselmo with the uncomplicated directness that only very small children possess, as if Anselmo were simply the next interesting thing that had appeared in the world and warranted examination. Anselmo walked to the gate. He did not open it. "Don Anselmo Vega?" the woman said. "Yes," he said. "My name is Rosaura Campos. These are my children, Tomás, Inés, and Beto." She did not gesture at them. She said their names the way a person states something important, clearly, without apology or decoration. "We've walked 3 days from Aguamiel. My husband, Rodrigo, died 8 months ago in a work accident at the Pedron quarry. We have 42 pesos and a change of clothes each. We're not asking you for pity." He looked at her. He looked at the 3 children. He looked back at her. "What are you asking me for?" he said. She met his eyes and said it simply, in a voice that had clearly been composing this sentence for the better part of 3 days on foot. "You have no one to till this land with you, Don Anselmo, and my children have no tata. Let us stay, not as beggars, but as familia." The word familia fell into the dry afternoon air like a stone into water. Anselmo felt it the way you feel something when it is aimed precisely at the place where you are most open, most unguarded, most honestly wounded. He had spent 12 years not being family to anyone. He had spent 12 years being the man who owned the grove, the man who paid fairly, the man who remembered Herminia in private and managed everything correctly in public. He had not been tata to anyone in any of those 12 years, or in the 34 years before them. He did not open the gate yet. "How did you know about me?" he said. "Señora Brígida, at the market in Aguamiel. She said you were alone and honest and that your grove was the best-kept land in the valley." "Signora Brigida talks too much," Anselmo said. "She said that too," Rosaura replied. "She said to tell you she still owes you a bottle of mezcal from the bet about the mango harvest 3 years ago." Something loosened in Anselmo's chest that was not his heart condition. He looked at them all again. The woman with her straight back and her trunk and her 42 pesos, the serious boy with the knapsack, the curious girl who was now looking very intently at the rows of orange trees as if she were already calculating something, the small boy still holding his mother's dress, who had not stopped looking at Anselmo with that open, uncomplicated stare. "Come in," Anselmo said. He opened the gate. "Tell me the rest of it." He led them up to the house and set them at the kitchen table, at the 3 chairs he had never moved, the 3 chairs that had waited in their stillness for 12 years, and he put coffee on, and he stood at the counter and listened to Rosaura Campos tell him the rest of it in a clear, factual voice, without embellishment, the way a person speaks when they are past the point where embellishment does any good. Her husband, Rodrigo, had worked the Padrón quarry for 6 years. A loading platform had given way without warning. The quarry had paid a death compensation of 3,000 pesos, the minimum required, paid in cash by a man in a clean shirt who had not made eye contact, and had sent no further communication. They had rented a room in Aguamiel for 8 months on that money, and on what Rosaura earned taking in washing. But the room's owner had sold the house, and the new owner wanted the room for his own family. She had asked about work in 3 other towns. Nothing. Señora Brigida had said, "Go to the valley. Go to Don Anselmo Vega. He is an honest man, and his grove needs people, and he is alone." "I can keep accounts," Rosaura said. "I kept the accounts for the Ejido cooperative in my husband's town for 4 years before we moved to Aguamiel. Tomas can work the grove. He's strong and he learns fast. Inés cooks and sews, and Beto—" She paused. "Beto is 5, she said, and for the first time her voice changed. Just slightly, just a fraction, just enough for Anselmo to understand what 5 years old meant in the calculation of everything she had just described. "He mostly stays out of trouble." "Mostly." Anselmo looked at Beto, who was sitting very still in one of the straight-back chairs, Herminia's chair, Anselmo noticed, without knowing what to make of it, and was turning an orange from the bowl on the table over and over in his small hands, examining it with the same uncomplicated attention he had directed at Anselmo at the gate. "That's my wife's chair," Anselmo said. Beto looked up. "Lo siento," Rosaura said, and began to move. "No," Anselmo said. "Leave him." He poured the coffee. He set it on the table. He sat in his own chair facing Rosaura, and for a long moment he looked at the table, at the 4 cups, at the 3 children arranged around it, at the woman who had walked 3 days and was still sitting up straight. He thought about the grove. 40 hectares, 6 permanent workers, a mango harvest he'd lost 30% of last year because the accounting had gotten confused and the irrigation schedule had slipped. He thought about the sewing room that he had not opened in 12 years. He thought about the pill organizer with Herminia's handwriting. He thought about the 4th chair, which was now occupied by a 5-year-old boy who was peeling an orange very slowly and carefully, in one long spiral of peel, with the concentration of someone performing surgery. "I have rules," Anselmo said finally. "Tell me," said Rosaura. "The workers are paid on the 1st of the month, no exceptions. The accounts are kept clean. Every peso in, every peso out. Receipts for everything. Nobody touches the irrigation lines without telling Polo Gutierrez first, because the system is old and there are tricks to it. The house is quiet after 9 at night because my heart needs sleep." He paused. "And there is a room at the end of the corridor that stays locked. That is not a room for anyone." Rosaura nodded once for each rule. "And in return?" she said. "In return," Anselmo said slowly, I will pay what I pay the Gutierrez brothers, 400 pesos a week, for you and Tomas together. The children sleep in the east room. You sleep in the small room of the kitchen. You eat with the house eats, and we will see. He picked up his coffee. We will see if this is what you say it is. Rosaura Campos put her hand flat on the table, not to shake hands, but the way a person places their hand when they are making something solid, when they are saying, here, this is real. This is where it begins. We will see, she agreed. The small boy Beto had finished peeling his orange. He held it up to show Anselmo. Perfect, intact, a single unbroken spiral of peel beside it. Tata, he said, pointing at Anselmo. Naranja. Nobody had told him to say it. Nobody had taught him the word for Anselmo. He had simply chosen it, the way small children choose things, entirely, without doubt, without a thought for whether it was appropriate or premature or more than the moment could hold. Anselmo looked at the boy. After a moment, he said, Yes, orange. He did not correct the other word. The weight of honest books. They moved in on a Thursday, which Anselmo would later think of as a strange choice. Not because Thursday was inauspicious, but because Thursday was his hardest day. The day in the weekly rhythm of the Grove when the most small decisions accumulated, when the week's problems had ripened without yet having the weekend's quiet to resolve them. He had said they could come Friday, but Rosaura had said they were already there, and their things would take 10 minutes to unpack, and she did not want to sleep another night under the open corridor of the Aguamiel bus station, with 3 children and a wooden trunk. He had said, fine. In 10 minutes, they unpacked everything. Rosaura had not exaggerated about the trunk. 3 changes of clothing each, a small tin box with a lock that she placed on the highest shelf of her room without explanation. He did not ask. A tin pot, 2 wooden spoons, a book. Not a novel, a ledger, narrow-ruled, with columns and dates already filled in from her years at the Ejido Cooperative. A photograph in a cardboard frame which she set on the windowsill of the east room where the children slept. A man in work clothes, squinting into the sun, one hand shading his eyes, smiling at whoever was behind the camera. Rodrigo, presumably. Rodrigo, who had been dead 8 months. Rodrigo, who had worked a quarry for 6 years without, apparently, anyone ever explaining that the loading platforms needed regular inspection. The children took the east room without complaint or negotiation. The room had 2 narrow beds and a cot. Tomas took the cot. Anselmo watched him do it without discussion, simply moving to the smallest option the way the oldest child in a difficult family always moves toward the smallest option, the extra work, the harder choice. And the girls, Inés, no, there were not 2 girls. There was Inés and there was Beto. And Beto went to whichever bed Inés pointed him toward, which was the one nearest the window, because Inés was already demonstrating that she had her own system for managing her younger brother, and her own reasons for every decision within it. The first morning, Anselmo woke at his usual hour and came down to find that coffee was already made. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Rosaura was at the stove with her back to him, and the clay mug, his mug, the one with the thumb indent, was filled and sitting on the table at his place. She had not used it herself. She had found it, understood which one was his, and filled it. He sat down. He drank his coffee. The accounts, he said when she turned around with her own cup. After breakfast, I'll show you what I have. I'd like that, she said. The accounts were a mild disaster. Not dishonest, Anselmo had never been dishonest, but imprecise in the way that a solo manager of a 40-hectare operation inevitably becomes when there is no one to check his work. Numbers transposed, a receipt from the irrigation supply company in San Cristobal filed under the wrong quarter, 2 invoices from last year's harvest not cross-referenced against the worker payment log, which meant there was a discrepancy of approximately 600 pesos that Anselmo had noticed but not resolved, because resolving it would have required sitting with the books for a full afternoon, and he had not had a full afternoon's worth of patience for it since Herminia had kept the books. Rosora sat across the table from him with the ledger open and did not say anything about the state of the accounts. She simply began working through them from the most recent entry backward, asking questions as she went. Clear, specific questions, not reproachful ones. Where does this receipt go? Who signed off on this payment? Is this the same irrigation company as last year or a different one? She wrote down the answers in small, neat script in the margins. By the end of 2 hours, she had found the 600 pesos, a transposition in the October harvest log, a small error with a large shadow, and had drawn a neat line through the error and written the correction beside it. It's 640, she said. Not 600. The extra 40 was from a fuel receipt that got filed with the payroll. Anselmo looked at the ledger. He looked at her correction. How long have you been keeping books? He said. Since I was 17, she said. My father ran a small tienda. I kept his accounts until I married. Your husband's accounts? She was quiet for a moment. Rodrigo was not someone who liked to see numbers written down, she said carefully. He preferred to keep things in his head. Another pause. That was one of the things we disagreed about. Anselmo understood from her tone that this was as much as she would say on the subject, and that it contained more than it appeared to contain. He closed the ledger. You'll take these over, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. Full access to everything. Income, expenses, payroll, the harvest log. He looked at her steadily. And I want to see the books every Sunday evening. Not because I don't trust you, because my wife kept them that way. Every Sunday we sat together and went through the week. And I think it is a good habit. Every Sunday evening, Rosora agreed. And I'd like to add a column. What column? Labor hours, yours included. If we're going to know what this land earns, we should know what it costs, including the cost of the people who run it, not just the people who harvest it. Anselmo looked at her for a long moment. My wife, he said finally, said almost exactly the same thing to me 31 years ago. He didn't mean it to be a significant statement. It was simply true, and it came out before he decided whether to say it. Rosaura received it quietly, without comment, and wrote Columna Horas de Trabajo at the top of a fresh page. Tomas began in the Grove the following Monday, paired with Polo Gutierrez, who received this information with the stoic acceptance of a man who has learned that his employer's decisions are final and often surprising. He's 14, Polo said. He's 14 and he reads and writes, and he knows the difference between a sick tree and a dry one, Anselmo said. Teach him the irrigation system. Polo taught him the irrigation system. By the end of the first week, Tomas could identify each of the 12 valve points along the main line and explain why 3 of them needed to be opened in sequence rather than simultaneously, an idiosyncrasy of the original installation that Polo had explained to every new worker for the past 20 years and that Tomas understood, apparently, on the first pass. Polo reported this to Anselmo on Friday with the faint air of a man who is impressed but is not yet going to admit it. He asks good questions, Polo said. What kind of questions? He asked why we don't close the south valve first instead of last. I told him it was because of the pressure differential at junction 3. He asked if we'd ever measured the pressure. I said no. He said we should. Should we? Anselmo said. Probably, Polo admitted. Tomas brought a notebook to the Grove on the second week and began recording. Valve sequences, soil conditions in different sectors, which trees in the oldest section were showing signs of stress. He did not ask Anselmo's permission to do this. He simply did it, the way a boy does things when his mother has raised him to see what needs doing and do it. Anselmo watched him from a distance on the third day, standing between the rows with his notebook open, measuring the distance between a stressed tree and the irrigation head with a piece of rope he'd taken from the equipment shed, making notes. He was working with the focused, unself-conscious concentration of someone who has decided that this land deserves his full attention and sees no reason to withhold it. Ines, meanwhile, had taken over the kitchen without anyone assigning it to her. She was 10 years old, and she cooked the way some people do mathematics, with an internal logic that was completely her own and that produced correct results by routes she could not always explain. The first week she made the meals simple: rice, beans, whatever vegetables were available. But on the 8th day she appeared in the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon and began doing something complex with a cut of pork shoulder, dried chilies, and a clay pot that she'd found on the highest shelf and that Anselmo hadn't used in years. By 7 o'clock, the house smelled like something that had not happened to it in a very long time. "Where did you learn to make that?" Anselmo asked, standing in the kitchen doorway in exactly the posture he'd occupied the first morning, watching someone else make the kitchen live. "My grandmother," Ines said without turning from the stove. "She said the secret is 2 kinds of chile, not 1. "She was right," Anselmo said. He hadn't tasted it yet. He didn't need to. He could tell from the smell. He sat at the table and ate dinner with 4 other people for the first time in 12 years. It was a strange physical sensation. The presence of sound at the table, the weight of being watched and not alone, the way Beto spilled something on the second bite and Rosaura corrected him quietly, and Ines handed him a cloth without being asked. The small, automatic choreography of a family that had been performing its rituals in reduced circumstances for 8 months and had developed a precision and a gentleness in those rituals that only reduced circumstances can produce. The trust question came at the end of the second week. Anselmo had not manufactured it. It arrived of its own accord, the way important things often do. Not through a crisis, but through a small, quiet moment that turned out to contain more than its surface suggested. Rosaura came to him one evening as he was sitting on the portal after supper, with the wooden box from the high shelf in the east room, the tin box with the lock, the one she had placed without explanation on the day they arrived. She set it on the table beside him and unlocked it with a small key she wore on a cord around her neck. Inside, 42 pesos in small bills and coins, rubber-banded. A folded paper, the quarry's death compensation receipt, 3,000 pesos with the payment date. A second paper, an account of how she had spent every peso of those 3,000 in the 8 months since, written in the same small, neat hand as the margin notes in Anselmo's account books. A third paper, a handwritten contract template she had drafted herself, specifying labor terms, accommodation terms, and what she described simply as los términos de permanencia. "I want you to hold the 42 pesos, she said. Anselmo looked at the tin and its contents. He did not touch them. "Why?" he said. "Because if the money is with me, there will always be a question," she said. "Not from you, maybe not yet, but from the workers, from the people in town who will see us here, from whoever else comes by and sees a widow with 3 children living in a man's house. If you hold the money, the question doesn't have the same shape." He was quiet for a moment. The dry season evening was going orange at the edges of the grove. "And the contract?" he said. "I want you to read it. I wrote what I think is fair. If you disagree with any part of it, tell me and we'll change it." She paused. "I've never entered into an arrangement I didn't understand in writing, even here, especially here." Anselmo picked up the handwritten contract. He read it slowly in the fading light. It was thorough, more thorough than he'd expected, more precise than any informal agreement he'd made with the Gutierrez brothers, who had worked for him for 2 decades on a handshake and a pay envelope. It specified the weekly wage, correctly, matching what he'd stated. It specified the labor duties, grove maintenance, account keeping, kitchen, general household. It specified the accommodation terms, and at the bottom, in a different ink, as if added later, as if she had thought about whether to include it, and then decided she would. In the event that the present arrangement proved satisfactory to both parties over a period of no less than 1 year, the parties agreed to revisit and formalize the terms of continued residence and contribution. He read that line twice. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "Yes. You didn't have a lawyer." "I couldn't afford a lawyer," she said. "But I know what an agreement needs to say." He set the contract down. He looked at the 42 pesos in their rubber band. He thought about 640 pesos found in a margin. He thought about a boy measuring trees with a piece of rope. He thought about a girl who knew about 2 kinds of chile. He picked up the tin box and placed it in his guayabera's breast pocket, which was not large enough for the box, but was the gesture he could make. "I'll put this in the house safe," he said. "I'll give you a receipt." She almost smiled. It was the first time he'd seen anything close to a smile. A very small thing, barely a movement, more of a relaxation, as if a particular tension had been maintained for 8 months and had just, by fractions, begun to release. "I'll write it down in the accounts," she said. "Good," said Anselmo. He picked up the papers. He picked up the contract. "And I'll sign this." He went inside and found a pen and signed it at the kitchen table. His full name, the date, and under his signature in his own handwriting, because he felt it needed to be said explicitly. "This is an agreement between people who work. What is earned here is earned, not given." He brought it back out and handed her the signed copy. She read his addition without expression, folded the paper, and put it in the pocket of her dress. Outside in the grove, the last of the evening light was going red through the orange trees. Somewhere in the house, Beto was singing something formless and half-invented at the top of his small voice, the way 5-year-olds sing when they are happy. Not a real song, just sound organized into the approximate shape of happiness. Anselmo sat back in his chair and listened to it. What would you have done if a woman had stood at your gate with 3 children and 42 pesos and an offer that was not charity but something harder and more honest than charity? Would you have opened the gate? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. After a moment, he reached into his shirt pocket and touched the edge of the tin box. He left it there. The room that had been waiting. The locked room was at the end of the corridor, and everyone in the house knew it was there, and no one spoke of it. Anselmo was aware that they knew. There was no way not to know. The door was visible from the kitchen if the corridor light was on, and the corridor light was on every evening. And the door was distinguishable from all the others by a small but unmistakable detail. It was the only door in the house that did not open. All the other doors had the particular slight give of interior doors in old houses, a half-resistance, a moment's pause before the latch yields. And this door had none of that. This door was simply a wall that had been fitted with a handle. Razara had seen it on the first day and said nothing. Tomas had noticed it on the second. Inés had walked by it several times in the first week, and Anselmo had seen her glance at it from the corner of his eye. But she had not touched it, had not rattled the handle, had moved past it with the particular tact of a 10-year-old who has been raised to understand that not every closed thing is closed for carelessness. Only Beto, in the 6th week of their residence, walked up to it and knocked. He knocked the way he knocked on every door, 3 quick raps, businesslike, as if he had a prior appointment. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again. He turned and looked at Anselmo, who was at the end of the corridor filling the lamp. "Nadie," Beto said. "Nobody." "No," Anselmo said. "No one is home." Beto seemed to find this acceptable. He went back to the kitchen. Anselmo stood at the end of the corridor for a long moment after Beto left, looking at the door. What opened the room, or what opened the possibility of it, was Inés. But not through anything she intended. It was the morning of the 7th week, on a Saturday, when the workers had the day off, and Tomas had gone to town with Polo Gutierrez for irrigation supplies. Rosaura was in the grove checking a section of soil that had been draining poorly. Beto was asleep in the mid-morning stillness that overtook him without warning and with complete conviction, the way sleep takes small children. The house was quiet. Ines was sewing. She had always sewn. She had told Anselmo this the third week, not as an announcement, but as a practical statement. She needed thread. Could she look in the storage cabinet by the kitchen? He had said yes. She had found a sewing kit that had been in the house for decades, sorted through it with evident expertise, extracted what she needed, and returned to the table, where she had spent the next 2 hours repairing a tear in one of Beto's shirts with a stitch so fine it was nearly invisible. On this particular Saturday, she was working on an embroidery project she had begun with thread she'd found in the sewing kit, a small panel of cloth, something she was inventing as she went, a spray of orange blossoms because the trees were what she saw every day, and the trees were what she had come to love. She was sitting at the table with the afternoon light on her work when she ran out of a specific color, a warm amber yellow, and went looking in the storage cabinet for more. The storage cabinet didn't have it. She stood thinking. She had seen thread in other places in the house, in drawers, in the backs of shelves, and she was methodical by nature, so she went through them one by one. She found several spools in a kitchen drawer. She found a tangle of cotton in the linen cupboard. And she found, in a basket on the lowest shelf of the hallway cabinet, a key on a plain iron ring with a small tag tied to it in a woman's handwriting. Cuarto de costura. Sewing room. She held the key in her hand. She looked at the tag. She looked down the corridor. She went to find Anselmo. He was on the portal with his afternoon coffee, reading a farm supply catalog that was 6 months out of date, which was how he read catalogs. Out of date, slowly, with the specific pleasure of a man who is not being rushed. "Don Anselmo," she said. She held out the key on its ring. "I found this in the hallway cabinet. I think it might be—" She stopped. She looked at his face. He was looking at the key the way a person looks at something they have been not looking at for a very long time, directly and without preparation, because preparation was no longer possible. "Yes," he said. "That's the key." A silence. "I wasn't trying to find it," Ines said. "I was looking for thread, amber thread, for the orange blossoms." "I know," Anselmo said. He set down his catalog. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the key in her hand. Then he said, "The room belonged to my wife. Her name was Herminia. She sewed." Ines looked at the key. "She kept thread in there?" "She kept everything in there." He paused. "She was in the middle of something when she died. I locked the door. I didn't—" He stopped. He tried again. "I didn't know what to do with it, so I left it." Ines held the key out to him. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it, at the plain iron ring and the small tag with Herminia's handwriting, the same handwriting as on the pill organizer, the L with its downward hook, the letters that he still copied every time he bought a new tray. He took the key. He stood. He walked down the corridor with Ines walking behind him at a careful distance, not following, but present, in the way that children are sometimes present for adult moments that need a witness without needing a participant. He put the key in the lock. He turned it. The room had the smell of 12 years of closed quiet, cedar from the wardrobe, the particular dry wood smell of old thread, something faint and floral that he could not immediately identify, and then could. A soap that Herminia had kept in a small dish on the windowsill, a lavender soap from a market in San Cristobal. And after 12 years it was nearly gone. The smell of it nearly gone. But not entirely, not quite. The machine was a treadle singer, dark and heavy, with the wooden cabinet it sat in still holding a spool of pale thread on the pin. The light came in through the slatted window and lay in bars across the machine, across the basket of fabric on the chair beside it, across the table where the hoop was still, after 12 years, still, in exactly the position it had been in when Herminia had last set it down. Anselmo stood in the doorway and did not cross the threshold. The embroidery was on a cloth that would have been, when finished, a tablecloth, the kind used at Easter, at Christmas, at the meals that mark the year. It was a large piece, nearly a meter square, with a border of flowers worked in silk thread all the way around 3 sides. The 4th side was incomplete. The border stopped halfway across and became a penciled outline. Herminia's careful pencil, still visible after 12 years. The flowers drawn in lightly so she could follow the lines with her needle. The needle was still threaded. It was still in the cloth, at exactly the point where she had left off. "Oh," said Ines. She had come to stand just behind his shoulder, and she was looking past him at the tablecloth in its hoop, at the finished 3 sides and the unfinished 4th, at the needle and the thread and the penciled flowers waiting. "She didn't finish," Ines said. "No," Anselmo said. "She didn't finish." Another silence. Then Ines said very quietly, not quite asking and not quite stating, "Someone should." Anselmo turned his head and looked at her. She was looking at the tablecloth, not at him. Her face had the particular concentration she wore when she was evaluating a piece of needlework. Serious, absorbed, running the calculus of thread and pattern that only certain people run, and that they run without knowing they are doing it. "You know that stitch?" Anselmo said. "That's satin stitch in the petals, and something else on the stems." "Stem stitch," Ines said immediately. "On the stems. I use it too." She looked at the border more carefully. "Her tension is better than mine. She pulled the thread tighter at the turns. I'd have to practice that." Anselmo crossed the threshold. He walked to the chair beside the machine. He picked up the hoop, gently, the way you pick up something that belongs to another time and that you are, for the first time in many years, allowing yourself to touch. He carried it to the window where the light was better and held it out to Ines. She took it. She examined it the way a craftsperson examines the work of another craftsperson, with respect, with attention, with a specific practical appreciation for the decision behind each stitch. "May I?" she said. He said nothing for a moment. His throat was doing something complicated. He had not been in this room in 12 years. He had not smelled the lavender soap in 12 years. He had not seen the needle in the cloth, the penciled flowers, the thread on the spool in 12 years. "Finish it," he said. His voice was smaller than he meant it to be. "Finish what she started." And then, because the room and the soap and the tablecloth and this 10-year-old girl holding Herminia's hoop had done what 12 years of managing correctly had not done, because the dam that a person builds against grief is always, eventually, outwitted by something unexpected and small and completely without cruelty. Anselmo sat down on the chair beside the sewing machine and covered his face with both hands. And for the first time since the Tuesday morning when he had come home from the grove to find Herminia on the kitchen floor with her hand still holding the counter, for the first time since then, he wept. Ines sat down on the floor beside his chair with the embroidery hoop in her lap. She did not say anything. She did not touch him. She threaded a needle from the basket and began, with the careful attention she brought to everything, to find where Herminia's thread had left off and where she would begin. The crisis came 3 weeks later, at the worst possible moment, which is the only moment crises choose. It was the height of the pre-harvest inspection period, the 2 weeks in late dry season when every tree in the grove had to be assessed for fruit count, disease, and irrigation need before the harvest crews were called in. Anselmo had been walking the rows for 4 days straight, longer than Dr. Medina would have approved, in heat that was worse than usual because the rains were late. Polo had told him on Thursday to rest. Rosora had told him on Friday to rest. He had said he would rest when the eastern section was done. He did not finish the eastern section. Tomas was the one who found him. It was 5 in the afternoon, the hour when the heat begins to lift and the light changes angle. And Tomas had come out to the grove with a water jar because Anselmo had been out since noon and no one had seen him come back. He found him at the junction of the second and third rows in the eastern section, sitting on the ground with his back against a tree trunk and his hand pressed flat against his chest. His face the color that Tomas had never seen on a grown person's face before and would not forget.
Don Anselmo, Tomas said. He crouched. Don Anselmo.
I'm here, Anselmo said. His voice was steady, which frightened Tomas more than unsteadiness would have. It's the heart. It happens. I need Dr. Medina. How far is the doctor? 2 hours on horseback. Night road. Can you ride? I can ride, Tomas said. He could ride. He had learned on the third week when Polo had put him on the old bay mare to move her from the lower pasture, and he had ridden her with the slightly terrified confidence of someone who has never ridden before and will not admit it. And he had not fallen. And the following week he had ridden again by himself. And by the 6th week, he knew the mare, and the mare knew him in the particular mutual way of horses and their regular rider. He ran back to the house, told his mother in 3 sentences what had happened, and was on the mare and out of the gate in 10 minutes. Anselmo was still in the grove. Rosaura went to him immediately, bringing the medicine kit and a folded blanket and the clay mug filled with water. She settled beside him on the ground, not in the way of someone performing a duty, but in the way of someone who has decided that wherever he is, that is where she will be.
Don Anselmo, she said. Tomas is gone. The doctor will come.
I know, he said. She could feel, sitting beside him, that his breathing was labored. Not the labored breathing of a man who is frightened, but the labored breathing of a man whose body is working very hard to do something that should not take work. She checked his pulse, too fast and slightly irregular, but present, strong enough to count.
Does it hurt?
She asked. Like a hand pressing, he said, not the shop kind, the other kind. She knew he meant the kind that does not kill immediately, the kind that announces itself and then waits to see what you'll do. She gave him his evening digoxin pill, 2 hours early, but it was there, and he needed it, with water from the mug, and she sat with him on the ground between the orange trees as the sun went down and the stars came out one by one over the valley, and she kept her fingers on his pulse and did not count aloud, because counting aloud would have made it into the thing it was. At 11:30 at night, Tomas came back with Dr. Medina. The doctor examined Anselmo where he sat. He had not wanted to move him, and the ground between the trees was clean and dry and had its own stillness, and said what Rosaura had already calculated. An arrhythmic episode, not a full infarction, the heart protesting rather than failing, brought on by heat and overexertion, and what the doctor described, with pointed evenness, as a complete disregard for medical advice. You can be angry with me next week, Anselmo said. I will be, Dr. Medina said. They moved him to the house carefully, Tomas and Polo, who had been woken and come down in his nightclothes. They put him in his bed. Dr. Medina adjusted the medication. He left instructions with Rosaura in the precise and detailed manner of a doctor who has assessed the person receiving instructions and found them to be someone who will follow them. Wake him at midnight for the next dose, he said, and at 6, and someone should be in the room. I'll be in the room, Rosaura said. She sat in the chair beside his bed all night. She did not sleep. She woke him at midnight, gave him the pill, waited while he went back to sleep. She woke him at 6. She was there when the morning light came through the window slats and fell across the bed and across her face as she sat in the chair with her hands folded in her lap. He woke slowly, in the way people wake when they have slept from exhaustion, and found her there. You're here, he said. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Tomas made it. He made it in just under 2 hours, Rosaura said. He knows the road now. Anselmo turned his head toward the window. The morning light was ordinary and complete, and the grove was out there in it. The 40 hectares, the third row in the eastern section where he had sat down on the ground and put his hand on his chest. Rosaura, he said.
Yes. When I am well enough, not today, not this week, I want to go to the notary in San Cristobal. I want to have some papers prepared. She looked at him. She did not ask what papers. When you're well, she said. When I'm well, he agreed. He closed his eyes. She poured water from the jug on the nightstand and left it within reach. She went to the door and then turned back. The tablecloth, she said. Ines has finished the fourth side, all the flowers. She'll show you when you're better. He did not open his eyes, but something in his face changed. Not large, not demonstrative, just a change. The way weather changes before a storm or after one. Good, he said. That's good.
The man who came to count things. The notary in San Cristobal was a heavy-set man named Licenciado Fuentes, who had known Anselmo for 20 years, in the capacity of a man who knows everyone in a small region who owns anything of value. He had prepared Herminia's death registration. He had witnessed the deed to the South Extension. He was, Anselmo thought, the closest thing he had to institutional memory outside of Polo and Camilo Gutierrez. And when Anselmo came into his office 3 weeks after the episode in the Grove, moving more carefully than before, but moving, Fuentes looked at him with the particular attention of a man who has been thinking about a person's paperwork situation for some years. Don Anselmo, he said, sit down. I'll sit when we're done talking, Anselmo said, which was a lie. He needed to sit, but he wanted to say it first and feel like himself for a moment before the business began. He sat. He told Fuentes what he wanted. He was specific, because he had spent 3 weeks in bed being careful and precise about what he wanted and in what order and for what reasons. He wanted a labor contract, formal, notarized, with teeth, between himself and Rosora Campos, specifying her duties, her compensation, and a provision that formalized her continued right to residence and management of the property in the event of his incapacity or death, provided that the contract had been in effect for no less than 1 year in good standing. He wanted a separate educational trust, small but real, drawn from the Grove's annual surplus, for Tomas, Ines, and Beto, accessible at 18, conditional on no condition other than reaching 18. And he wanted, finally, a will. A will, Fuentes said. A will, Anselmo said. The property goes to Rosaura Campos and her children in equal shares, with a stipulation that the Grove cannot be subdivided or sold for a period of 20 years after my death, to give them time to make it theirs properly. Fuentes wrote this down. You have family, he said, not accusingly, just stating what was in the register. I have a nephew-in-law's cousin, Anselmo said, a lawyer in the city. His name is Ramiro Duarte. He calls me at Christmas and once in the spring, and last year he asked me, twice in the same conversation, what the market value per hectare of orange grove was in this region. Anselmo paused. He asked my workers, not me. He asked Polo Gutierrez. Fuentes' pen stopped. Polo told me, Anselmo said, last November. Ramiro called the Grove office directly and asked Polo what the land was worth. He didn't know I would find out. I see, said Fuentes. I don't dislike Ramiro, Anselmo said, which was mostly true. He is what he is. And what he is a man in the city who has calculated that he is the next logical heir to a 40-hectare orange grove, and who has therefore developed an interest in orange groves. He met Fuentes' eyes. He is not wrong about being the next logical heir. He is simply wrong about what logic I've decided to use. Fuentes prepared the documents over 10 days. Anselmo reviewed them line by line on a Sunday evening with Rosaura sitting across the table, and read her everything that concerned her, the contract, the trust, the will, in full, without summarizing or softening. She listened with her hands flat on the table,
the same posture as the night she had placed the tin box between them, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said,
"The part about the 20-year restriction, is that for them or for you?" He thought about it. "Both," he said. "I don't want them to have the option to sell it in a moment of difficulty. I want it to be the thing that holds when everything else is uncertain, the way land should be." She nodded. "Then I agree," she said. "All of it." He signed. She signed. Polo Gutierrez and Camilo came in on Wednesday to serve as witnesses, which they did with the gravity of men who understand that they are signing something that matters, and with the satisfaction of men who have worked a piece of land for 2 decades and are glad to see it go to people who will work it. Ramiro Duarte arrived on a Saturday, in what Anselmo estimated was the 3rd month after the signing, though he could not have been certain because Ramiro did not announce himself. He appeared, as people appear when they have calculated the optimal element of surprise, in a rental car at the gate on a Saturday afternoon when the workers were off and the house was quiet. He was 52 years old, trim with the particular grooming of a city lawyer. Not expensive exactly, but precise. The kind of precise that signals that precision is being signaled. He wore clean trousers and a collared shirt and carried nothing, which was itself a kind of statement. Because a person who arrives without luggage for a visit of indeterminate length has decided that the visit will be exactly as long as the visit needs to be, and no longer. Anselmo saw him from the portal. He watched Ramiro get out of the car, look at the house, look at the grove, look at the house again. He watched Ramiro's eyes go to the east side of the property, to the new irrigation line Tomas and Polo had installed in the 2nd section, which had required some earthwork and was visible from the gate. He watched Ramiro take out his phone and take a photograph. Then Ramiro saw Anselmo in the portal and waved, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased to see his relative.
"Tio Anselmo,"
he called. He was not, technically, Anselmo's nephew. He was the cousin of the man who had been married to Anselmo's wife's sister's daughter, which made him nothing. A name in the address book, a Christmas collar. He had called himself Tio for 20 years, and Anselmo had never corrected it. He walked up to the portal. He shook Anselmo's hand warmly. He said how good Anselmo looked, which was flattering and inaccurate, and how well the grove was looking, which was accurate and not flattering, but informative about what he had noticed on his way in. He asked about Anselmo's health, with the specific concern of a man who wants to know how much time is left. Rosaura appeared in the doorway with coffee. Ramiro looked at her. "My colleague, Señora Campos," Anselmo said. "She manages the accounts and the household." Ramiro looked at her with the assessment of a man who has arrived to evaluate one thing and has found another thing present that he had not prepared for. He said, "Ah," and then, "How long has she been here?" "Almost 5 months," Anselmo said. "And the children I saw in the yard, those are hers?" "Yes." Another assessment. Then, brightly, "Wonderful, wonderful that you have some company." He sat down in the chair that Anselmo had not indicated and accepted the coffee from Rosaura with thanks that were formal and brief. He stayed 3 hours. In those 3 hours, he asked, in various forms and by various approaches, the same questions. What was the current state of the harvest yield? What was the status of the land title? Were there any plans to change the management structure? Had Anselmo given any thought to what he called the long-term picture for the property? He asked if Anselmo had updated his will recently. He asked this near the end, folding it into a discussion of what he said was general estate planning, his professional advice as a lawyer who thought about these things. "I've updated everything," Anselmo said. "Fuentes handled it all in the spring." Ramiro smiled. "Good. Good for you. It's important to have things in order." He paused, and the pause was precisely calibrated. "And the property itself, the 40 hectares, is it still solely in your name?"
I only ask because I know some landowners have moved to It's in my name, Anselmo said. For now.
Ramiro received this with no change in expression. He finished his coffee. He said all the right things about the grove looking well and Anselmo looking well and what a good thing it was to have reliable help. He shook hands again on his way to the car. He was warm and smooth and professionally friendly all the way to the gate. At the gate, he turned back once.
I'll try to come again before the year is out, he said. I'd like to look at the new irrigation work more closely. It looked impressive from the road. And, of course, I should catch up on the paperwork situation. Make sure everything is in order for everyone's sake. He smiled. Family should know these things. Anselmo said nothing. Ramiro got in his car and drove away, and the dust of the road settled behind him in the late afternoon, and the grove was very quiet.
Rosaura came and stood beside Anselmo.
He'll come back,
she said.
Yes, Anselmo said. He's going to want to see the documents.
I know.
She was quiet for a moment. Then,
Are you afraid of him?
Anselmo turned this over with the deliberateness of a man who is being asked something real and intends to answer it honestly.
No, he said. I am not afraid of a man who photographs my irrigation line.
He picked up his empty coffee cup from the table on the portal.
But I'll tell Fuentes he may be coming.
He went inside. In the east room, through the open door, he could hear Beto explaining something at length and with great authority to a doll that he had acquired at some point and whose origins Anselmo had never successfully established. The explanation involved, as near as Anselmo could tell, the correct sequence for opening the south irrigation valve, which Beto had heard Tomas explain approximately 200 times, and had internalized with the completeness of a 5-year-old for whom everything interesting is a story worth retelling.
First you open the big one, Beto was telling the doll. Then you wait. Then the small one. Polo says you wait because otherwise, boom.
He's going to be a farmer,
Rosaura said, appearing behind Anselmo in the corridor. Yes, Anselmo said. He did not say anything else. But he stood in the corridor for another moment, listening to Beto instruct the doll, before he went to bed. Everything that remains. A. The second visit.
Ramiro came back in November, 7 weeks after the first visit, and this time he came with a folder. The folder contained what he described at the portal before he had been invited to sit, as some documents he'd like to go over together. A phrase he delivered with the brightness of a man who knows the phrase is insufficient camouflage, but has nothing better. The documents, Anselmo could see from where he stood, included a printout of what appeared to be a land registry inquiry, and a form whose header, visible when Ramiro shifted his grip, read, Solicitud de verificación de testamento. Request for will verification. Anselmo said, Come in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where Rosaura had laid out 42 pesos and a self-written contract, the same table where Ines had set down Herminia's embroidery hoop, the same table where a 5-year-old boy had peeled an orange in one long spiral and called Anselmo Tata without being told. Ramiro opened his folder.
Pio, he said, I want to be direct with you. I've been thinking about the property since I was here in the summer, and I should be honest, I've spoken to a colleague who handles rural land matters, and he's flagged some concerns. What concerns? Anselmo said.
About the arrangement here, Ramiro said. He said it carefully, as if the words were heavier than usual, and he was mindful of dropping them.
An elderly man, alone. With guests, I should say, with a family who has come to live with him. It's not that I question anyone's intentions, you understand. It's simply that from a legal standpoint, there are situations where, Ramiro, Anselmo said, where a vulnerable party can be, Ramiro. Ramiro stopped.
Anselmo reached into the breast pocket of his guayabera. He placed on the table side by side 3 documents.
The first was the notarized labor contract. The second was the educational trust agreement. The third was a sealed copy of the will with Fuentes's notary stamp visible on the envelope and a handwritten note clipped to it in Fuentes's hand. In the event of inquiry, this office will confirm the existence and terms of this instrument to any party authorized by the testator. Fuentes, Lesieger.
He had written to Fuentes after Ramiro's first visit. Fuentes had prepared the note and mailed it back within the week. Ramiro looked at the 3 documents. He looked at the contract. He looked at the trust. He looked at the sealed envelope with Fuentes's note. Anselmo said, "The contract has been in effect for 5 months and has never been in dispute. The trust is funded from the annual surplus and has been filed with the municipal registry. The will is notarized and witnessed and on file with Licenciado Fuentes, who has worked with this property for 20 years and who I asked specifically to be available to answer any questions a member of my family might have." He folded his hands on the table. "If you have a question about the paperwork, Ramiro, Fuentes is in San Cristobal every weekday until 5. Ramiro was quiet. He looked at the documents again. He looked at the folder in his hands, at the request for will verification, at the land registry printout. He closed the folder. "I came here because I was concerned," he said. He said it quietly, and Anselmo believed that somewhere inside it was true. Not primarily true, but there, the way a small, true thing can exist inside a larger calculation. "I know," Anselmo said. He said it without heat. "You're the only family I have left, Ramiro. I understand that you've been waiting to see what happens with this land. I'm not angry with you for that." He paused. "But I've made my decisions. They are legal, they are prepared, and they reflect what I have decided is right. The people in this house have earned what I am giving them. It is not charity, and it is not weakness, and it is not something a lawyer or a land registry inquiry will undo." He picked up the 3 documents and put them back in his pocket. "Now," he said, "Rosora has made pozole, and there is enough for 3 people. You can stay if you want to stay, or you can drive back to the city." He stood up. "But if you stay, we don't talk about the land again tonight." Ramiro sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Outside, Beto was audible somewhere in the yard doing what Beto did in the yard, which was everything and anything at maximum volume. Inside, the smell of the pozole was warm and particular and real. Ramiro put his folder on the seat beside him and said, "I'll stay for dinner." He stayed for dinner. He drove back to the city afterward, and he did not return. He called it Christmas that year, and the year after, and the year after that. On time, reliably, a little shorter each year, a little less focused on the property and a little more on the ordinary small things, how the harvest was going, whether the south section had recovered from the drainage problem. Once, this was in the 6th year, asking after Beto, who had apparently been mentioned by Polo Gutierrez when Ramiro had called the Grove office. Still, he never fully disappeared and never fully arrived. And eventually he became what he had always been, a name in the address book and a voice at Christmas, which is its own kind of relationship, and not nothing. B. The years between time in a grove moves with the trees. Tomas turned 15 the year they fixed the south drainage problem, a project he had identified, planned, and overseen himself, with Polo as his senior partner and Anselmo as the final authority on expenditure. He had presented Anselmo with a hand-drawn map of the drainage issue, its root cause, and a proposed solution in the kitchen on a Sunday evening after the accounts review, and Anselmo had studied it for a long time and then said, "Do it." And Tomas had done it, and the south section had been gaining yield ever since. At 16, he began keeping the payroll. At 17, he negotiated the contract with the fruit cooperative in San Cristobal, the same cooperative Anselmo had sold through for 30 years, renegotiating the base price per crate upward by 11%, which Anselmo had been trying to do for 4 years and which Tomas accomplished in a single meeting because he had prepared, with Rosaura's help, a comparison of regional prices over 7 years that the cooperative representative found impossible to argue with. Anselmo had been there. He had not said a word. He had sat in the back of the cooperative office and watched this 17-year-old boy from a quarry town do what he himself had never quite managed to do. And he had felt something that he thought, on the drive home, might be pride. The specific, surprising pride of a man who has discovered, late in life, what it feels like to be a father. At 19, Tomas took over the full management of the Grove's accounts and operations. Not because Anselmo was no longer capable, he was, mostly, but because the handover had been planned for, and planned handovers are better than forced ones. And Tomas was ready, and the Grove was better with him running it than with it running him. Ines turned 14 the year she entered the regional handicraft exhibition in San Cristobal with 2 pieces, her own original embroidery work and Herminia's tablecloth, completed, mounted, labeled with both their names. Herminia Vega de Anselmo, 1944 to 2010, and Ines Campos, born 2003. She won 2nd place in her category. She came home with the ribbon and set it on the kitchen table and said, with the precision that characterized everything she did, "The 1st place piece had better tension in the corner joints. I'm going to practice that." She practiced that. The following year, she won 1st place. At 15, she began teaching embroidery to women in the town. Not a formal class, just a Tuesday afternoon in the church hall, whoever wanted to come. Some weeks it was 4 women. Some weeks it was 14. She charged nothing and accepted what people brought: thread, cloth, once a jar of honey, twice nothing at all. Anselmo watched her walk down to town on Tuesday afternoons with her basket and thought about Herminia. Not with grief, or not only with grief, but with the particular feeling of watching something be carried forward. The tablecloth hung in the dining room. On holidays, Rosaura set it on the table, and they ate under the embroidered flowers, Herminia's 3 sides and Ines's 4th, all of it complete now, the border running all the way around, unbroken. Beto turned 10 in the year that the old bay mare finally died of age, peacefully, in the pasture, which caused a grief in the household that was small, but genuine. He had loved that horse with the complete unselfconscious love of a child for an animal that has always been there. And he cried for 2 days, and then asked, with the pragmatism that underlay all his feeling, whether they could get another horse. They got another horse. He named her Tata, not for Anselmo directly, he explained, but because she was brown and steady and didn't complain, which he said with a sideways look at Anselmo that made Anselmo cough into his coffee. He grew into the Grove the way a tree grows into the space available to it, not quickly, but completely. By 12, he could diagnose citrus greening by sight, a skill that Polo Gutierrez said he'd taken 30 years to develop, and that Beto appeared to have acquired by simply paying attention to every tree as if it were a person with something specific to say. By 14, he was on the permanent crew during harvest, not because he was needed and not because anyone had decided it, but because he was always there anyway, and the trees seemed to do better in the sections where he worked, which was the kind of thing that made agricultural sense if you understood that trees respond to consistent attention, and less sense if you didn't. Rosaura's hair went gray at the temples in the 8th year. She did not seem to notice, or, if she noticed, did not mind. She still kept the books every Sunday evening, still went through the week's accounts with Anselmo, later with both Anselmo and Tomas, with the same methodical clarity that had found 640 pesos in a transposition 14 years before. She had become, by the gradual process by which people become things in a house, the person the Grove organized itself around, not its owner, not yet, but its center, the still point from which everyone else took their bearings. There was a Sunday in the 10th year when Anselmo came to the table for the accounts review and found the books already balanced, the week's summary already written in Tomas's hand in the new ledger, and Rosaura sitting across from him with her coffee, and the 3 children, Tomas, 24 now, Inez, 20, Beto, 15, scattered around the house doing the things they did, and the grove outside in the evening light doing what it had done for 60 years. And he sat at the table and looked at all of it, and felt the specific peace of a man who has settled everything that needed settling.
Rosaura, he said,
Yes?
do you remember what you said at the gate? The first day?
She looked at him.
I said, let us stay, not as beggars, but as familia.
Yes, he said. He looked at his coffee. I think you were right about what you were. She was quiet for a moment. Then,
I think we both were.
C. The last morning. Don Anselmo Vega died on a Tuesday in February in the 81st year of his life, in his own bed, with the morning light coming through the window slats. He had been declining for 2 years, slowly, the way a fire declines when there is no more wood, but the coals are still deep and red. His heart, which had been working too hard for 30 years, had finally found its own argument for rest. Dr. Medina had told him in January that the rest of the year would be what it was going to be, and Anselmo had received this information in the way he received all information, directly, without drama, and with the immediate practical question of what needed to be done while there was still time. He had done everything. He had gone over the accounts with Tomas one last time, not because Tomas needed him to, but because he wanted to sit with him at that table one more time and go through the numbers the way he and Herminia had gone through them every Sunday for 34 years. He had walked the grove with Beto, slowly, with his cane, stopping often, and pointed out the 3 trees in the eastern section that had been there when his father planted them, the original stock, older than Anselmo himself. He had sat with Inés for a long Tuesday afternoon and watched her embroider and said almost nothing, because there was almost nothing left that needed saying. He had talked to Rosaura the night before when the house was quiet. The papers are all with Fuentes, he said. You know where everything is. I know, she said. The south valve, the sequence. Beto knows the sequence, she said. He's been telling his horse about it for years. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night was very still. I was alone a long time, he said. I know, she said. I didn't know how to stop being alone. I had forgotten. He looked at the ceiling. You came and I didn't know what you were. I thought you were a woman asking for shelter. We were, she said. No, he said. You were more than that. You came to finish what needed finishing. He turned his head toward the locked room, unlocked now for years, Inés's sewing basket on the chair by the machine, the tablecloth gone to the dining room wall. Herminia's cloth is finished. The grove has people who know it. The books are clean. He looked at her. What needed finishing is finished. She held his hand, the way you hold the hand of someone who has said what they needed to say and is ready for the quiet. In the morning, all 3 children were in the room. Beto had fallen asleep in the chair in the corner sometime in the night and had not been moved. Inés had her mother's hand. Tomas stood by the window. And Selma looked at them, one at a time, each face, the way you look at something you want to remember and know you will not need to because you are going to where memory is not required. To Tomas, the grove is yours to run. You know it better than I did at your age. Don't let anyone tell you it's too much for you. To Inés, finish your work. Whatever you're working on, finish it. To Beto, you'll be a good farmer, better than me. A pause. And learn to open the south valve correctly. Polo's not going to be there forever. To Rosaura, last. This is your home. It was always going to be your home. I just had to be here first, to keep it until you arrived. He closed his eyes. The morning light was on his hands. Outside, the grove was doing what it always did in February. The trees still and cold in the early light, the fruit not yet arrived, the soil holding everything that the roots were drawing up in the dark and slow work that is not visible but is constant, the deep patience of things that grow. He died the way the good die, completely, without argument, having said what needed saying. Epilogue. What the land became. They buried him beside Herminia in the small cemetery behind the church in town, and Polo and Camilo Gutierrez carried the coffin, which was right, and half the town came, which was also right. The 40 hectares were transferred to Rosaura Campos and her children, according to the will, with Fuentes's quiet efficiency and without contest. The 20-year restriction on sale or subdivision was registered with the municipal land office and noted in the deed. It would expire, if the math was followed, when Beto was in his mid-30s, by which time, Anselmo had reasoned, it would no longer matter. They would not need the restriction because the land would be so thoroughly theirs that selling it would be as unthinkable as selling a name. He had been right about that. Tomas ran the grove into its most productive decade. He expanded into a second variety in the 5th year, a late-season fruit that extended the harvest window by 3 weeks and gave the cooperative contract a new set of numbers to work with. He hired 6 additional permanent workers from the town and from the ejido and paid them the way Anselmo had paid people, fairly, on time, with receipts for everything. Inés opened a small textile school in the church hall, not the Tuesday afternoon sessions, which she still ran, but a formal school, 4 days a week, with 6 students at a time. The tablecloth hung in the school hall on a wooden frame, in a place where the light fell on it at midday. She told the students what it was, who had started it, and who had finished it, and when, and what that meant about the relationship between work and time and the people who come after you to complete what you began. Beto managed the grove's day-to-day operations alongside Tomas. He had turned out to be exactly what Anselmo had said he would be, a good farmer. Better than Anselmo at the age of comparison because he had grown up in the grove and knew it the way a person knows their own body, not by study, but by continuous inhabiting. He still talked to the trees when he was alone. He had always done this. Nobody had stopped him. On the first anniversary of Anselmo's death, Rosaura brought the tablecloth from the dining room and spread it on the table for dinner. She set it with the good plates and lit 2 candles and called the children. Tomas, 26, Inés, 22, Beto, 17. None of them children anymore in the ordinary sense, but always her children in every sense that mattered. And they ate together at the table with 4 chairs, the table that had waited through 12 years of solitude and had never been moved, the table whose chairs still wore the small marks of all the years they had held people, the careful wear of presence. Rosaura sat in the chair that had been Herminia's. She had been sitting there for years. It had become hers, the way all things in the house had become hers and her children's. Not by displacement, but by continuation, the way a river continues without being the same water. After dinner, Beto cleared the plates. Tomas went over the week's accounts, which Rosaura still read every Sunday out of habit that had become love. Inés refolded the tablecloth with the automatic tenderness of a woman who has touched that cloth 1,000 times and knows every stitch of it. The grove was outside in the February dark, doing what it always did, quietly, patiently, without drama, the work that is not visible but is constant, drawing everything it needs from the dark soil and the water in the deep ground and the memory of all the hands that had ever worked it, and giving it back in the form of fruit, season after season, the same and different, the way all living things give back what they have been given.
So tell me, which moment stayed with you the longest? Was it the night Tomas rode 2 hours in the dark to bring the doctor, refusing to let one man's stubborn heart be the last word? Was it the afternoon Inés picked up Herminia's needle and, without fuss or ceremony, simply continued what a woman she had never met had left unfinished? Or was it the morning Beto sat in the chair across from Anselmo, a 5-year-old with an orange and an open face, and called him Tata because the word was true, and so he said it?
Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story found something in your chest that you didn't know was waiting there, subscribe to Alma en Historias, because there is always another story here, and someone in it has been walking a long road toward the right door for a very long time.